Hello and welcome to week 5 of the class. This is the second week we'll be spending on formative assessment. So it's formative assessment part 2. And this week we'd like to focus on providing effective praise and feedback to students. There's been a lot of research that suggests that we don't provide enough feedback to students, and it's one of the most effective things that you can do. As a matter of fact, I once read a study that indicated that only about 9 seconds of individual feedback is given to any student on a particular day in class. Feedback is the transfer of information from the teacher to the student based on assessment. And so when we provide feedback, we want to be able to tell students, to encourage students, but also to tell them ways to improve. When you're giving effective feedback, you should consider several things. First of all, the amount. Many teachers give way too much feedback when they're giving feedback. So, for example, when I'm grading your writing, I'm not going to correct all your grammar and correct all your spelling and all of your APA mistakes, and that would just be depressing. Probably, I know that would be depressing for me if somebody did that, but I might pick out 3 or 4 things about your paper and say, I want you to focus on improving this, and give you that feedback, and then look for change over time. The timing should be as soon as possible. If you give an assignment and it's graded and you hand it back a month later, the feedback's probably not going to be very effective. Generally, we like to see feedback given within a week. In college classes, I think the standard is no more than 2 weeks. The mode: you can give feedback or praise orally. You can give it in written form on, for example, a homework or a test. You can even give a demonstration for feedback, depending on the context. Audience: you should use developmentally appropriate language. So you wouldn't use the same words, for example, with a kindergartner that you would with a 12th grader. I've seen feedback given in the form of smiley faces to first graders who aren't able to read yet, and that's completely appropriate. The type of task affects the amount of feedback you give. For example, if you're giving multiple choice tests, you're probably not going to give a lot of feedback. What you might do is, if you notice that most of your class missed a particular multiple choice item, you might review that together in class and say, here's why A wasn't a good option, here's why B is the best option. A project, or for example, or a paper, you're probably going to give a little more feedback on. And finally, another thing to consider is the learner's ability. You need to give them feedback relative to their ability. So instead of thinking of everyone having to hit the same mark, think about some students being at different points along the learning continuum. A famous Russian psychologist by the name of Lev Vygotsky, you might have heard of him, visualized learning as a continuum, and people are at different points on their continuum. And so your job is to get them from one point to the next point. Learning occurs in something we call a zone of proximal development. And so you can't get students to jump over three points, or if you think about it as a ladder, up 3 rungs of a ladder, but you can get them to go to the next rung on the ladder. Effective feedback is goal-directed, so you're going to be focusing on having the learner visualize a goal in his or her mind and trying to get him or her to move towards that goal, not comparing themselves to other. Scaffolded. In other words, it's sort of like what I was saying on the previous slide. You're trying to scaffold them or support them and get them to the next rung on the ladder, to get them to the next point on the learning continuum. And there are a lot of different ways to do this, to provide scaffolding. So, for example, you can show them the next little step. That's considered scaffolding. I touched on self-referenced rather than having learners compare themselves to others in the class. You did the best job in the class, Sally. You would have them compare themselves with their own previous work and note progress or improvement. And finally, standards reference. What this means is you want to get students to focus on how much progress they're making towards achieving standards or learning objectives. There's been a lot of research on this concept of mastery learning versus performance learning, starting back in the 60s and 70s with Benjamin Bloom, and then more lately Carol Dweck. Carol Dweck especially sees two types of learners. Mastery learners compare their work to some standard of mastery and see their own progress towards mastery, and so are less likely to become discouraged if they hit a glitch. So in terms of mathematics, for example, if I'm saying, oh, I've got to learn to master two-digit multiplication problems, and my teacher is constantly focused on that standard objective, I'm much more likely to be able to survive little setbacks. Okay, well, I haven't gotten there yet, but I'm going to. Whereas performance learners compare their work to others' performers or to some artificial standards such as grade. And teachers sometimes reinforce this by encouraging them to see their status in black and white. Bobby's good at math, Sally's bad at math. And they're much more likely to become discouraged if they hit a glitch. So, for example, if I am doing a math test and maybe I studied more, maybe I'm just better at a particular topic, and I get 100 on the test, and the teacher hands it back to me and says, good job, I can tell you're a good student in math. Then the next time when I don't do as well, maybe I haven't studied as hard, or maybe it's a little more difficult for me, that particular topic, and I get a 60, and the teacher hands it back and maybe says what happened, I might start to internalize I'm not good. I'm a performance learner. I'm not good at math. And so I'm much more likely to become discouraged. Whereas if the teacher had handed that test back and said the first time, I can see you really mastered two-digit multiplication, and now you might want to think about this, I'm much more likely to focus on the standards and the mastery of the standards than I am on my own performance compared to a grade, for example. We want to encourage an attitude towards mastery learning in our classroom, and we can do this by using effective feedback and praise. So let's look at some of the general characteristics of effective feedback or praise. We never want to use general feedback. We don't want to say something like, good job, because that doesn't tell the student anything. And we say it a lot. I know we all say it. But instead, you want to be specific about what you're praising the student about or providing feedback. So you did a good job conjugating verbs on that assignment. So the student knows specifically what you're referring to. You also want to avoid what we call internal attribute-based praise or feedback versus standards-based. It's like I was saying before. It's not good to say you are so good at math, because that encourages performance learning. Whereas I can tell you have learned how to do two-digit division is standards-based. You could tie that to a standard, mastering two-digit division. So specific and standards-based. This slide talks about self-comparison versus comparison to others. So I know students compare grades all the time, but as teachers, we don't want to encourage that behavior. So instead of saying, Sally understands better than anyone how to do this science experiment, you say, Sally, you've learned over the last month how to write hypotheses. So that's a self-comparison, and Sally will learn to be a mastery learner better that way. It's also a good idea to include, if possible, ways to improve the performance. And you can do this with even very young children. For example, if you are teaching pre-kindergarten and you're trying to teach one-to-one correspondence and counting blocks, instead of just saying, nice job of counting those blocks, which is specific, so it's not terrible, you could say, nice job of counting those blocks. Now let's try touching them one at a time as we say the numbers. And so we've given the student not only feedback about their performance, but you've also suggested a way to improve the performance. let's practice analyzing some feedback and praise and trying to determine if it's effective or ineffective based on the characteristics we just spoke about. So let's look at the first one. Lynette, that was a great job you did yesterday. Would you classify that as effective or ineffective praise, and then think about why? We might classify this as ineffective praise because it's not specific. We don't know what Lynette did that, and neither does Lynette, that she doesn't know what she did that what was good, and it's not related to any standards. What about the second one? Jeff, your writing is improving. Your B's are much better because you're making a straighter line and not a loop. Is this effective or ineffective praise, and why? We might classify this statement as effective praise. It is specific. It says what the student did well. It's descriptive. However, it might be better to include an area to improve as well. The last one on this slide, Miguel, you did the best in the class. Would you classify this as effective or ineffective? We might classify it as ineffective. Again, it's not specific, it's too general, and it compares Miguel's performance only to other people, not to his past performance. Let's try some more. John, I can see by your work that you are really good in math. Is this effective or ineffective praise? We might classify this as ineffective. It's too general, and it attributes success to ability, to that internal ability. That's not something a student can really control, so that encourages a poor outlook if things get rough. I'm not good at math anymore. Finally, good work. This time you doubled the length and width before adding them to find the perimeter of the rectangle. Is that effective or ineffective? We might classify this as effective. It's specific, descriptive, and it shows progress. So keep these traits of good praise or feedback in mind, especially as you're doing the posting for this week's discussion post. Now I'd like to talk for a minute about another assignment, your fieldwork paper, the interview with a teacher or administrator. Most of you probably already selected the individual that you'd like to interview. This is due October 23rd, so not too long from now. It's worth 10% of your grade. What you're going to do is conduct a 15 to 30-minute interview with either a teacher or administrator. This could be somebody at your own school if you're currently working. And you're going to ask them questions about assessment. You may record the interview if you'd like to help you, of course, with the participant's permission, to help you remember, or you can take notes. I find it's effective to copy and paste the questions that I'm going to use and then print that paper out and take notes right under the questions. These are some of the guiding questions. You might think of others, but again, the interview needs to focus on their use of assessment. So you might ask them how they use assessment in their classroom or if they're administrators, schools, or districts. What kinds of assessments do they use? Do they create them? Are they standard? If they create them, how do they go about creating them? This third bullet is an important question. How does their use of assessment inform instruction and other aspects of school programming? So we've been focusing on assessment, not just for assessment's sake, but to that loop, that feedback loop about how do we use it to improve our instruction. What do they find useful or not useful about teacher-created and standardized assessments? How does the current culture of accountability affect them personally, particularly with the high-stakes standardized testing, and why? Once you've done the interview, you should submit a 4 to 5 page double-spaced paper in which you use the course readings to analyze your interviewee's experiences with the assessment. First, you should give a short explanation. So, You don't want to just start in with the questions. You want to provide some context. The interview was conducted on October 10th, 2016 from 9 a.m. to 9:30 a.m. in the interviewee's office. I would encourage you to not use the interviewee's real name. Use a pseudonym. So, for example, Mr. P or Mrs. S. You're going to write it in a narrative format. So you're not going to type the question and then give your answers. You're going to write it more narratively. So you could do a paragraph about each question. You could group the questions together into some heading and then put it under a heading. And some of the things you need to think about at the end is, what did you learn from this person? So after you explain the interviewee's comments, what you need to do is to think about your reflection. What did you learn? Did you think about anything particular we've discussed in class? How does the interviewee's experiences reflect what you know about good assessment, purposes of assessment? And you're going to be sure to support your analyses with ideas from the reading. So, for example, if the interviewee is discussing a formative assessment, you could put a quotation from our text in, according to Slavin, and then put the quotation in and then write something that connects it to your interview. I want to encourage you to use the APA Purdue link that I've put on the home page of the course. All of your papers should be written in APA format, double-spaced, and APA has very specific guidelines about how you do things. So, for example, if you're writing numbers, one of the general APA rules is that if the number is 10 or above, you generally write it in a digit form, like 10 for 10. If it's below 10, you would write it out in a word, like NINE for 9. So there are lots of these little rules, and particularly when you're doing in-text citations and references, the link is on the home page, and you can go there, you can look at the rules, and it will help you with your papers. So when you finish the assignment, you're going to upload it to Blackboard so that it can be graded. And you're also going to upload to TaskStream and your fieldwork form to TaskStream. There are some new requirements on TaskStream. I put all the documents, by the way, that you need you'll need to renew your accounts in TaskStream. So all the student key codes and everything are on the home page. If you have any questions about any of this, feel free to email me. If you have problems getting your TaskStream subscription renewed or making that work, I encourage you to email our TaskStream coordinator. Her name is Harriet Lew, L-E-W, and her email is hlew@mercy.edu. So I hope you've enjoyed this week's lecture. I've made the rest of the module pretty light so that you'll have time to work some more on your formative assessment assignment. Everybody have a good week.